There are 8 things in the average Australian grocery trolley right now that were not in anyone's trolley 50 years ago. Not because they didn't exist yet, because the versions being sold today are not the same product they used to be. The name is the same. The packaging looks familiar. The price feels reasonable. But what happens inside the body after years of regular consumption? That part is rarely explained on the label. And this isn't a story about one suspicious ingredient or one rogue manufacturer. It is a story about what industrialization did quietly to ordinary food, and why that quiet shift explains a lot of what people are dealing with today. Once you see the pattern, it shows up everywhere. And this is where the real problem begins, not on the label, but behind it. Most Australians trust the supermarket. That trust is not irrational. Woolworths and Coles are regulated. The food on the shelves has passed inspection. Nutritional panels are required by law, but standards describe minimum thresholds. They do not describe what happened to the food on the way to meeting them. The question worth asking is not whether the food is safe in a legal sense. The question is whether it still nourishes in the way that food nourished people before industrialization changed how it was made. Those are 2 very different questions, and most people never think to ask the second one. Food 1. Sliced white bread. Bread is the most ancient human food. Every culture made it. The process was always the same: grain, water, time. The time was important. Traditional bread fermented slowly. That fermentation did something specific. It broke down phytic acid, a compound naturally present in wheat that binds to minerals and reduces their absorption. Slow fermentation also partially predigested the gluten, making it easier to process. Industrial bread eliminated the time. The Chorleywood process, developed in the early 1960s and adopted widely across Australia's commercial baking industry, replaced slow fermentation with high-speed mechanical mixing, chemical additives, and shortened proof times measured in minutes rather than hours. The result is a loaf that can go from raw ingredients to packaged product in under 4 hours. That is not bread in the ancestral sense. It is a bread-shaped product assembled at industrial speed. Research published in the British Journal of Nutrition has explored differences in glycemic response between traditionally fermented bread and modern commercial equivalents. The fermentation process affects how quickly starches convert to glucose in the bloodstream. Remove the fermentation and you change that response. For people managing blood sugar or simply trying to maintain consistent energy across the day, the process behind the bread is not a trivial detail. The label says bread. What that word describes has shifted considerably over the past 60 years. Food 2. Flavored yogurt. Yogurt has a long history in human diet. Fermented dairy products appear across dozens of traditional food cultures. The fermentation produces beneficial bacteria along with organic acids that change how the dairy is digested. That is genuine yogurt. What sits in most Australian refrigerator aisles under the word yogurt is different in several important ways. Flavored yogurts, the kind sold in individual serves, marketed at children and adults alike, typically contain added sugars ranging from 12 to 24 grams per serve. Some contain more sugar per 100 grams than cola. That sugar does not simply offset the probiotic benefit. For many bacterial strains present, a high-sugar environment is actively hostile. The beneficial bacteria that fermentation produces are not designed to thrive in a heavily sweetened product. More significant is what the sugar load does to the broader context of eating it. A fermented food is supposed to support the digestive environment. A fermented food with 20 grams of added sugar does something more complicated to that environment. What is observable without debate is the shift. Yogurt moved from a fermented staple eaten with very little sweetness to a dessert category product that borrows the health language of the original. The word yogurt on the label tells you the production method. It does not tell you what the product actually does. Food 3. Breakfast cereals marketed as healthy. The cereals most worth questioning are not the obvious ones, not the ones covered in chocolate or frosted sugar. Those declare themselves. The ones worth examining are the ones positioned as adult health food. The ones with words like whole grain, high fiber, and heart health on the front of the box. A 2021 review by Choice Australia examined sugar levels in breakfast cereals widely available at Australian supermarkets. A significant number of products carrying prominent health claims on the front contain between 20 and 30% sugar by weight. The front of the box is marketing territory. The back of the box, specifically the ingredients panel, is where the product describes itself honestly. There is a specific manufacturing pattern worth recognizing. A grain is refined, most of its fiber and natural nutrient content removed in the process, then shaped into a flake or puff. Vitamins and minerals are added back synthetically, a process called fortification, and the resulting product is described as nutritious. The fortification is real, but synthetic vitamins added to a heavily processed grain do not behave identically to nutrients present in an intact whole grain. Bioavailability, how much of a nutrient the body absorbs and uses, differs depending on the food matrix that nutrient arrives in. The cereals your great-grandparents ate were not manufactured. They were whole grains, minimally processed, eaten with nothing added. That version of breakfast is still available. It simply doesn't have a marketing budget. And this is the part most people miss. The issue is rarely one product. It is a pattern running across entire categories. Once you see it in bread, you see it in yogurt. Once you see it in yogurt, you see it in cereal. Convenience drove the original change. Cost-cutting refined it. Marketing covered the result with health language. That is the sequence. And it happened quietly, over decades, without a single announcement. Food for vegetable oils, canola, sunflower, soybean. Before the mid-20th century, Australians cooked predominantly with animal fats. Butter, lard, dripping, tallow. These fats have been part of the human diet for thousands of years. They were replaced gradually and then comprehensively by industrially extracted seed oils. The replacement was partly driven by genuine concern about saturated fat and heart disease, concerns that emerged from research in the 1950s and 1960s, research that has since been substantially revisited. But it was also driven by industrial economics. Seed oils are far cheaper to produce at scale than animal fats. The extraction process for most commercial vegetable oils involves high heat, chemical solvents, typically hexane, and deodorization to remove the smell that develops during processing. The resulting oil is shelf-stable, but the processing alters the fatty acid composition in ways that have become a subject of ongoing nutritional research. The key concern involves omega-6 linoleic acid, present in high concentrations in canola, sunflower, and soybean oils. The ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the human diet appears to matter. Pre-industrial diets are estimated to have maintained a ratio of approximately 4 to 1. Modern Australian diets, heavily reliant on seed oils, are estimated to average ratios significantly higher. Some researchers suggest 15 to 1 or more. The implications are still being studied. What is less debatable is that the shift happened, it was rapid, and it was driven by industrial economics as much as health evidence. Cooking with butter, extra virgin olive oil, or cold-pressed coconut oil returns you to fats that predate industrial processing. That is not a health claim. It is a historical observation. Food 5. Processed deli meats. Ham, salami, bacon, mortadella. These items have a permanent home in Australian refrigerators. They are convenient, familiar, and often positioned as a protein source. In 2015, the World Health Organization's International Agency for Research on Cancer classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen. This means the evidence that processed meat increases the risk of certain cancers, particularly colorectal cancer, was considered sufficient to establish a causal link. This was not a fringe finding. It was a consensus review of over 800 studies. The mechanisms discussed include nitrates and nitrites used as preservatives in most commercial deli meats, which can convert to N-nitroso compounds in the digestive system. High-temperature cooking of cured meats can also produce heterocyclic amines and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, both studied in relation to cancer risk. The classification does not mean occasional consumption carries extreme risk. Risk is a function of dose and frequency. It means regular, long-term consumption at the levels common in Australian households carries a measurable elevated risk. Most Australian households consume these products multiple times per week. School lunchboxes, breakfast plates, party platters. The IRC finding was widely reported in 2015 and then, for most people, quietly forgotten. The deli section did not change. The purchasing habits did not change. But the classification did not change either. Which of these foods is in your kitchen right now? Drop it in the comments. Not as a confession, just as a starting point for a different kind of conversation. Food 6, flavored instant oats. Plain rolled oats are one of the most straightforward, genuinely nutritious foods available in an Australian supermarket. They are minimally processed. They retain natural fiber, including beta-glucan, a soluble fiber studied extensively in relation to cholesterol management and blood sugar response. Flavored instant oats are a different product. The oats have been cut smaller, pre-cooked, and rolled thinner to accelerate preparation time. That processing changes the physical structure of the grain. The starch becomes more immediately accessible to digestive enzymes. The result is a higher glycemic response, closer to the blood sugar impact of white bread than to the slower burn of whole grain. A 2012 study published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition found measurable differences in blood glucose and insulin response between instant oats and less processed alternatives. Then there is the flavoring. A single sachet of apple and cinnamon or golden syrup instant oats typically contains 12 to 15 grams of added sugar. The health associations built around oats, around beta-glucan, around fiber, around traditional porridge, are borrowed and applied to a product that undermines most of them. The sachet feels like a health choice. The nutrition panel tells a different story. Plain rolled oats from any Australian supermarket take 5 minutes longer. They cost less per serve, and they are, in a meaningful nutritional sense, a completely different product. Food 7, fruit juice. Orange juice is perceived as one of the healthiest things a person can drink. The association runs deep. Breakfast freshness, vitamin C, the image of a half-squeezed orange on the label. That perception was largely built through marketing in the latter half of the 20th century. It does not reflect how fruit juice actually behaves in the body. A whole orange contains approximately 12 grams of naturally occurring sugar. It also contains fiber, both soluble and insoluble, that significantly slows the absorption of that sugar. A glass of orange juice contains the sugar of 3 to 4 oranges, roughly 45 grams, with the fiber removed entirely. That sugar enters the bloodstream rapidly. Fructose, the primary sugar in fruit juice, is processed almost entirely by the liver. In large doses, delivered quickly, it behaves differently from glucose. Research from Robert Lustig at the University of California, San Francisco, published in Obesity Reviews, explored this hepatic load in detail. Juice sold as no added sugar does not contain added sugar. It does contain the full concentrated sugar of multiple pieces of fruit, stripped of the fiber that originally moderated its impact. The body does not read the label. It processes the sugar load. The distinction between eating fruit and drinking fruit sugar is one of the more significant nutritional gaps in everyday awareness. It is not often discussed in contexts where juice is still positioned as a health drink. Food 8, packaged multigrain bread. This is the one that carries the most trust. And trust, when misplaced, is the most costly mistake. Multigrain bread occupies the premium health shelf in every Australian supermarket. It costs more than white bread. It carries the language of health, seeds, grains, fiber, natural. The packaging uses earthy colors and rustic typography. It implies you have made the responsible choice. The ingredient panel rewards closer reading. The first ingredient in many commercial multigrain breads is still refined wheat flour, white flour with whole grain components added after the fact. The seeds visible on the crust are real, but the base of the bread is often not meaningfully different from white bread in terms of how the grain was processed. Under Australian and New Zealand food standards, Bread can be labeled multigrain based on the inclusion of more than one grain type. There is no minimum requirement for what proportion of the bread must consist of whole, unrefined grain. The word multigrain describes how many grain types are present. It says nothing about how those grains were processed. A bread made from refined wheat flour with scattered seeds on top meets the definition. A bread made from stone-ground whole wheat flour with minimal processing also meets the definition. They are not the same product. The label does not make that distinction visible. Genuinely different bread exists in Australian supermarkets. Stone-ground, fermented over many hours with a live culture, made from minimally processed grain flour. It tends to sit at the end of the bread section in smaller quantities, often without the marketing reach of the major brands. It also tends to go stale faster. That is not a flaw. A bread made without preservatives and industrial accelerants does not last 2 weeks in a bread bin. That is how you know you're looking at something much closer to actual bread. This connects to something much larger than 8 grocery items. Every food on this list was changed for the same underlying reasons: to extend shelf life, to reduce cost at industrial scale, to achieve consistent appearance across millions of units, to speed up production. None of those goals are dishonest in themselves. They're the logical outcomes of building a food system designed to feed large numbers of people cheaply and reliably. The problem is that optimizing food for industrial distribution and optimizing it for long-term human health are often different objectives. When they conflict, the industrial objective tends to win. The health language on the label describes real attributes. This grain is present. This vitamin was added. But it does not describe the whole picture. The whole picture includes how the food was made, how it behaves in the body over decades, and what it replaced. None of this requires a dramatic overhaul. The practical shift is smaller than it sounds. In the bread aisle, read the ingredient panel before the front of the pack. The first ingredient should be whole wheat or stone-ground flour. If the bread lasts more than 5 days without going stale, something is keeping it that way. In the cereal aisle, the most nutritious options often have the least marketing. Plain rolled oats. Plain wheat biscuits with a single ingredient. If the box carries multiple health claims, read what is actually in it. With yogurt, plain full fat, no added sugar. Sugar content per 100 grams should sit under 5 grams. That is naturally occurring lactose. Add your own fruit. With oils, butter for higher heat. Extra virgin olive oil for lower heat and dressings. Both predate industrial seed oil processing by thousands of years. With juice, eat the fruit. The fiber is part of the food. Removing it and drinking the sugar is not nutritionally equivalent. With deli meats, reduce frequency rather than eliminate entirely. The IRC classification is about cumulative exposure, rotating toward less processed proteins. Poached chicken, tinned fish, eggs, changes that over time. These are not rules. They are adjustments that compound quietly, in the same way that the original changes compounded quietly in the other direction. The grocery store is not the origin of this story. It is simply where the end of a very long supply chain becomes visible. Everything on the shelf arrived through a system built over 70 years, shaped by specific economic pressures, communicated to consumers through specific marketing language. Understanding that system changes what you see when you walk down the aisle. Not with alarm, with clarity. And once you have that clarity about food, the same lens applies elsewhere to other everyday products, other familiar habits, other things that changed quietly while the original names stayed the same. Because this same pattern appears in what happened to fermented foods broadly, and what happened to the way grain was milled before industrial rollers replaced stone. And once you see it there, the full picture becomes considerably clearer. Subscribe if you want more of this. No sponsorship, no products to sell, just a more honest way of looking at what is already in your kitchen.